Hi, thanks for joining us. We begin a report with the first presidential debate of 2024. Where else? In 3 hours, President Biden and former President Donald Trump will face off for 90 minutes with no audience, no prepared notes allowed, and their mics muted when it's not their turn to speak. The venue is Atlanta, Georgia, the heart of a key battleground state, also one that was at the center of Trump's efforts to overturn the election the last time these two candidates went head-to-head for the presidency. Chief political analyst and the regular host of the Daily Report, John Dickerson, joins me now. John, I've never interviewed someone who's the host of their own show, but we'll give this a shot.
No, it's great. And viewers are like, wait, they've switched seats.
Hold on a second.
I'll come on Saturday.
We'll have, that'd be great. I heard at least two people on my way in today say this was the biggest campaign moment in decades. Is that hyperbole or anywhere close to fact?
We don't know until the debate happens. It's hyperbole, of course. There are a lot of people who are interested in making this a big campaign moment. But in a campaign that's so tight, any moment could be the big moment if something goes awry for one of the two candidates. But we also know historically that debates, despite all the hype, despite all the coverage, despite all the moments that we can recite, actually don't change anything. But of course, this year it's different. It's coming before the conventions, and we have two presidents facing off.
Let's talk about the timing. I mean, it's in June. We're almost, not 4.5 months, but almost 4.5 months before the election. That is odd.
It is odd. Both candidates wanted it for different reasons. The incumbent wanted it more to create a choice between two candidates, not a referendum, right? He wants to hug Donald Trump and say, this is it. Don't judge me against some abstract notion of what I could have done. Judge me against who the alternative candidate is. But it also could mean that this gets digested and passes through and we are on to the next thing soon enough. In other words, it happens too early in the cycle to actually have an impact. Again, it'll really depend on what happens in the evening and then how everybody reacts to that.
CBS polling seems to indicate that most people are watching tonight not thinking their minds are going to be changed, but more for the amusement, I guess, of watching this, the theater of it.
Yeah, which should keep our expectations low about debates are important, but they're not the whole bundle. When you think about what it means to be a president and what the challenges of the job are, a lot of those don't come up in a debate. For example, decision-making skills. You don't test that in a debate. So we should always remember that what we're seeing on the stage is not the same as what the job actually is. But to that polling number, what it shows us is we live in a partisan country, and a lot of people are going to vote for whichever team they're going to vote for, and the results of this evening won't matter.
I got a funny reaction the other day when I suggested the debate might even lean into being boring because the mics are muted and because there's commercial breaks. Is that going to interfere with the normal energy you see in a debate?
The lack of an audience will interfere with it also depends on how the two men decide whether they want to inject energy into the evening. But I think the lack of an audience will matter in terms of the energy. And also just, we could hope, I think the best thing for America would be a boring debate, because that means it would actually talk about the things that matter. There are huge questions in front of the country, and actually getting to the heart of those questions would be boring, but also would be terribly useful. Anything that's too exciting might distract us from all of these real questions we have to answer.
You're always so great at putting these things in perspective. I mean, where do we look at this in terms of the evolution of debates and how we got to this moment?
We got to this moment because television entered into all of our lives, and it became presidential campaigns always take on the flavor of the culture. So when America became a television culture, debates came into the center of the presidency because it was something everybody could watch. People could make a judgment based on their own eyes. What a wonderful thing for democracy. What we then learned is that sometimes what we saw in the debate was different from the way that people behaved in the rest of their lives. And that's one of the key things to remember about this debate. We have more information about these two men and how they will perform under the tests of the office than we have ever had before. So what happens on the debate stage may inform us, but the real thing is their records and their temperament and their character as attested to by the people who've worked with them.
It's the same thing with conventions. They used to actually do something, and then they just became theater.
That's exactly right.
So is there a way that someone can gauge, I guess we're maybe going to see it on television tonight, we'll know immediately whether it's a win or a loss?
Yeah, if there's a huge fumble when Gerald Ford in 1976 said there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, people were like, that's a problem. So if there's a moment like that,
When Dukakis responds in a certain way that
Right.
Bernard King asks him a question.
And that's a great example. You know, how Dukakis responded to this hypothetical question about his wife being assaulted has nothing to do with the office.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the office, but it mattered a lot in the campaign. In the Ford case, where he said there's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, that mattered. We were in the middle of the Cold War. If the president doesn't know what the main threat, and that's the thing to watch for, is do these two men, one of whom perpetrates a lie about the last election, which is an act of fantasy, do they see the world clearly, the threats America faces, and do they have a plan? That's really important information to have.
Which candidate has more pressure on them?
Biden. He's the incumbent, and he's in trouble. I mean, voters are in his own party are not as enthusiastic for him as they are for the other candidate. He is not where you want to be as an incumbent in the battleground states. And he has this pervasive question about the optics of his behavior, which is not what the presidency is about, but it is what his campaign faces. And this is a moment where he can potentially dispel some of those optical questions. And that's why it matters more for him tonight, probably, than his opponent.
Thanks for letting me fill in for a few days.
I'm very grateful, and I'm just glad I'm going to get to come back someday.
We'll be watching with you later tonight, John. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
CBS News political director Finn Gómez and campaign reporter Aaron Navarro both join me now from the debate venue in Atlanta. Finn, so you spoke today with a senior advisor from the Trump campaign. What did she say about the plan for tonight?
Hi, good evening, Jeff. We're just a couple hours away from this first presidential debate of this cycle. And again, the first time we've seen these two on the same stage in 4 years. Yes, I did speak to a senior advisor on the campaign, Danielle Alvarez-Ryder, who primarily works and focuses on the communications component of the campaign. But I did ask her specifically, what issues will the former president focus on in this debate? What is he going to target? And here's what she had to say, Jeff.
The thing I'll say is that both gentlemen on the stage will be referred to as Mr. President. And what that means is that voters, as they think about the future and the decision they're going to make, get to contrast two records: a record of success by President Donald Trump and a record of failure, weakness, and dishonesty by Joe Biden. What the American people are looking for is a discussion about the issues. We know that polling tells us that that discussion includes rising prices, that includes the border, that includes the economy, and that includes the chaos at home and abroad under Joe Biden's failure.
Now, that is the outlook and what we expect the former president to lead with, to focus on. I did speak with another senior advisor on the campaign and asked him about strategy. What was the preparation ahead of this debate with the former president? And he said essentially that they're really gonna target the current president's record, President Biden's record. They're also going to they say that President Trump is more disciplined than he's ever been before. They really stress that. They believe that this time around in this debate, it's really going to be focused on discipline. However, he also said, you know, he does have that sort of unpredictable nature, of course, and he expects him to roar, is what this senior advisor said about the former president.
Roar, okay. Aaron Navarro, to you now. We did learn that Mary Trump, but perhaps unsurprisingly, is supporting Joe Biden at the debate against her uncle. What do we know about how the Trump team has responded?
Right. Well, so far, Trump's campaign and the former president have not addressed Mary Trump, his niece, being part of the Biden campaign spin room head on. They attacked what they called radical surrogates, such as Representative Jasmine Crockett and former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, helping with the Biden campaign, but not addressing Mary herself. And as you mentioned, not a huge surprise. She backed Hillary Clinton in 2016 after Trump was convicted on 34 counts for that hush money trial in New York. You saw Mary Trump on the news, on the airwaves, saying that the jury made the right decision. But her inclusion from the Biden campaign is part of an overall effort from them to show that there is a big tent against former President Trump, from Nikki Haley voters, former Republicans like Adam Kinzinger, and former staffers of his White House. Mary Trump is just the latest name on that list.
Finn, what else are we hearing about the Biden team's plans for tonight?
Yeah, Jeff, I had a really long and detailed conversation with a top Biden official just a little while ago, and he told me that they're focused on two things. And he said this specifically, said punching and being presidential. Punching by going against and being more aggressive towards former President Trump and allowing him at the same time to tell his story and not allow Trump to tell his story. And also presidential. They may clash, they may counter, but also to remind the audience, to remind the American people that he is in the White House. He's the one who is the president. He is the one who is dealing with these major issues across the country and world, and to really lean into his record and to tell his story as opposed to Donald Trump defining that in this debate. I've also talked to Governor Newsom, the governor of California, who says that it's very important to allow President Biden, to really determine and set the agenda, to really show and demonstrate his contrasts and visions against Donald Trump. They have very strong, divergent visions of the country looking ahead and how they'll lead this country, and those two things are really that are really going to be focused on. I'm being told by the president.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Aaron, one more to you. A major part of this campaign, obviously, is the TV and social media ads. There are some new ones out today that have really been flooding the airwaves. What more can you tell us about those?
Well, there's a lot out there from both the campaigns and outside groups, but two stick out to me from each side. The first, the topic of abortion. Biden's campaign says there will be two new ads, including one airing during the debate itself about abortion. This follows the Supreme Court decision in regards to Idaho. And on the Trump side, they have an ad insinuating that President Biden would not be able to serve all 4 years in a second term, and that another vote for President Biden is just a vote for Kamala Harris, his vice president, to take over. Those two stick out to me.
Aaron Navarro and Gómez from Atlanta, thanks so much. Our pre-debate analysis continues after this at 7 p.m. Eastern with a special edition of America Decides, followed by a special report at 8. CBS will also carry this debate, hosted by CNN, starting at 9 p.m. Eastern. Then we'll have post-debate coverage starting at 11 p.m.